I've had a number of people ask questions about the tariffs that were recently implemented and what are the implications on supply chain management. So I want to go through that fairly quickly. It's pretty complicated though, so it might take a while. But I want to just talk about the implications of it and what I've been able to investigate looking into what's happening here on the recent tariffs that were applied. On April 2nd, an executive order was released. It's fairly lengthy, so I'm going to jump to the actual impacts of what's happening. In Section 2, if you scroll down, you'll see that the U.S. government is now going to charge a new 10% tax on all products imported into the United States, which increases from 10% up to a specific number above 10% for a number of trading partners listed in Annex 1. But for everyone else, including our best trading partners, including countries that have recently removed tariffs on the United States, including uninhabited islands, that there is now a 10% tariff being placed on goods imported from those locations. So across the board, everything is now going to increase by 10%. The cost of things imported into the U.S. will be increased by 10%. And for many countries, that will be even higher. So they include an annex, which lists all the different countries and additional charges being charged to places like Switzerland or South Africa, China. They all have kind of an additional surcharge on the tariff above the 10%. You might have seen something like this being passed around or in the news media. This is a list. This is the justification for the tariff that's being presented by the White House. And the first thing that I thought when I saw this was I wanted to see where the numbers were coming from. So along the left side, you see all the different countries. In the middle, you see tariffs charged to the USA. And first of all, that's not a thing that exists. Is the USA isn't being charged tariffs. The USA doesn't pay any tariffs. The way a tariff works is if you import a good into a country, you pay tariffs on that product to the country that you're in. So for example, if the US has a tariff, I import a product to the US, I then pay the US government that tariff. It's a tax that I pay to the government. So no one's charging the USA tariffs, so I don't know what that is. But it says tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. So I'm curious what that calculation is, and we'll dive into that in a little bit. And then the third column is USA discounted reciprocal tariffs. This is the reciprocal tariff rate that's being charged to people. And these are really high tariff rates. Most tariff rates are not anywhere near these numbers. And I'll show you a couple of examples, especially because these are across the board tariffs, not a tariff on a specific type of good or a specific product. These are all goods being imported into the United States. This is a massive scope of tariffs. So I want to kind of just talk a little bit about the top two. So when I first read through this, I look at China and I say, I don't think China has 67% tariffs on US goods. Maybe they do, not sure, but I don't think that they do. And then I look at the European Union and it says 39%. So I think I want to know how accurate this number is. So what is Europe's tariff rate on US products? Now, one of the trickiest things about calculating European tariffs or US any tariffs is that every product has its own tariff rate, and it's really complicated to find out what the tariff rates are. So it's really kind of difficult to find out what it is. But if we just go ahead and look on it, if we go to the World Trade Organization, on average, they say the EU has an average tariff rate of 5%. And the Commission says the average tariff on goods traded between the EU and US is 1% for both sides. So it's about 1% both ways. And that's very low, especially compared to this, which is saying 39% or 20% the amount that we're going to be charging the EU on tariffs. So we're off by orders of magnitude that are pretty problematic. If the actual number is 1%, both ways, then that seems relatively equivalent. We don't need reciprocal tariffs in that case. But we can go ahead and see where these numbers came from because they released an argument explaining where these numbers came from. So this is from the Office of the United States president. Reciprocal tariff calculations. Here's the summary. Basically, they say in order to balance the trade deficit, we're going to do some stuff. We're going to reduce imports. How much do we need to do that? They show the equation that they're using to calculate that. So one of the things that's interesting is when you look at the first table released, they're calculating this middle column, and that'll make sense if you actually go through and look at the data. But that's the number that they're calculating with this equation. But they changed the name. So tariffs charged to the USA. Now they're talking about reciprocal tariff calculations, the tariff rate necessary to balance bilateral trade deficits. So this is a different thing that they're calculating than they're reporting it as. But let's go ahead and walk through this equation because this is an equation that's fundamentally changing the tariff rate. And they calculate this for all of the different countries. And then I'll show you what it looks like they do. They divide it by 2. And then they have that be the gold column. So whatever number they calculate, they then divide it by 2 because dividing by 2 is easier. I don't know. I don't know why they divide by 2. They just do. But this equation, we can calculate what they're doing in this calculation. So the first one, T sub I, is the tariff rate, the change in the tariff rate necessary to make this change happen. The top one, X sub I, let's see if I can find that. Total exports, and M sub I is total imports. So this is exports minus imports divided by M sub I divided by imports. So this X minus X sub I minus M divided by imports. So that's basically the trade deficit divided by imports. And then they have these 2 different constants that multiply the effect. So let's see what those constants are. So epsilon is the elasticity of imports with respect to prices. So let's figure out what that is. So elasticity is basically a measure that says if something increases by 1%, how much does that impact the demand of that good? Elasticities of 1 are when those are the same. If I increase the price of the good by 1%, the demand of that good goes down by 1%. And most of the time that's the case, where if you increase the price, the demand goes down. In some cases, it's a larger effect. In some cases, it's a smaller effect. So we can pull one of the sources here. So down here, they reference one of the sources. And we can pull that up and see kind of what that looks like if we jump into it. This is the article that they reference, Globalization and the Gains from Variety. And if we just jump straight down to 2 examples of elasticity, the product with the highest elasticity was crude oil at 17.1. So when crude oil prices changed, the behavior, the consumption rate changed a lot because you can substitute it with other products and because it's a commodity. So you're not really sold that I really need to buy that crude oil when there are other alternatives available. The one with the lowest one was footwear, where if the price changed on footwear, we still purchased a similar amount of footwear. We cared about the footwear we were buying and making sure it was the kind. So if the price changed, we still wanted the shoes from that country. And you can kind of see what the scope of those different things are for different products. So motor cars are 3, crude oil is 22, footwear is 2.4. The bigger number means there's a bigger change in demand based off of a change in price. And you can kind of get a scope for kind of like what they are. They sort it by commodity or differentiate products or reference priced. Just thinking about commodities, that's basically products that are very substitutable, and differentiated are products that are not so substitutable. So just grabbing the means down here for commodity-based products is 3.5, 2.9, and 2.1. So that's kind of the range. Most products tend to be likely somewhere between 2 and 3.5 using this data from 1990 to 2001, which is pretty old to use on data for globalization right now. But that's where they get that number from. But they explain it here. Recent evidence suggests that elasticity is near 2 in the long run. So I'm not sure why they said 4. They said the price elasticity was set at 4. It seems to be less than 4. And the best evidence that they had said it was 2. So I'm not sure why, but they say it's to be conservative. They say that we used a higher elasticity. So to me, being conservative in an equation is if you have a reliable source of data the most conservative thing is to use that source of data. So they say that the evidence says it should be 2. Use 2. That's the most conservative approach. A non-conservative approach would be to change that number in any way because now I'm less conservative. Now it's a more radical assumption that it's 4 instead of 2. But we saw that it was somewhere between 2 and 4, so it's at least sort of reasonable. And then the next number, this little y thing, is the elasticity of import prices with respect to tariffs, or, as they say up here, the pass-through from tariff to import prices. So again, I'm going to go back to a tariff is an additional tax on import products. If you give me a tariff of 10% and I'm importing something worth $1, I pay $1 to the supplier and I pay 10 cents to the government for the tax. The cost to me is $1.10. So to me, this is a really simple calculation. The pass-through from tariffs to the import prices is 1. Because if I have to pay a tax to the government, I'm going to pay the tax to the government and my supplier is not going to pay that for me. It's very unlikely that I'd be able to convince them to pay it for me because it's not their tax and they don't have to pay it. But you could maybe argue that they'll lower the price slightly to help accommodate that. And so we can look at data on pass-through rates to see if that's the case. So we could pull up the economic impact section of section 233 and 301 from the United States International Trade Commission. And this was an article looking at what was the impact on these types of things from previous tariffs. You can look at, for example, pass-through and just search for that and say what was the impact of the previous ones. There was a 10% ad valorem tariff raised on the price of U.S. imports from China by about 10%. That seems exceptionally similar to what's happening right now. It's a flat 10% from a country. What was the impact on prices? There was a nearly 1-to-1 increase in prices of U.S. imports from the tariff. This is nearly complete pass-through. So in other words, this is 100%. This is going to be exactly 1. That's the best estimate we can have. You can search for pass-through from different ones. You can look for steel. You can look for aluminum. And in all cases, what they're finding is that it's effectively 1, nearly 100% pass-through of tariffs into the U.S. for steel and aluminum industries. It was for different tariff changes, different time windows. The pass-through rate is just 100%. So my intuition was correct. But they choose here a number that is 0.25. So what they're saying here is that the elasticity price, only 25% of that cost is going to go to the actual cost, which it just seems absurd. So I don't like that number very much. But at least they gave me a number to work from. Now, the interesting thing here then, so what I have here is the top is the trade deficit divided by the imports, right? The total number of imports. And that gives me basically like a fraction of how much of the trade deficit. Like it's a measure of the deficit that we have with any country. So the bigger the deficit, the bigger that number is going to be. And then we multiply it by these two constants. So parameter values for E and little y were selected. This is 4, and this is 1. If I multiply those together, that's 1. So they're multiplying this by a constant of 1. So what we can do is we can just get rid of these two constants because they're equal to 1 and simplify it to just the trade deficit divided by the imports. Okay, that's a very simple calculation. I think including the elasticities is kind of a good idea if we're going to do a calculation like this because, especially if you go to one of these sources, we can see that the elasticities change for different product types. So if we're going to do this calculation and care about elasticities, we should use elasticities differentiated by product types, or at least by country, not just for everything ever. And again, the elasticity of import prices would also have a similar impact. And if you're actually doing math on economics, elasticity tends to be calculated something more like this. That's an estimation for the export market. If you go through any of the sources that were included in this, you can see here's how we actually calculate these different things. And these equations are far thicker because you need to have a lot more reliability in your assumptions when you do economics. So I have some concerns about the depth of the economic principles that were applied in this equation because I don't see it. I don't see any depth. I see trade deficit divided by imports, and that's being used as a flat rate. And that's what's calculated into the 67%, 39%. So China, we buy a lot of stuff from China, and they don't buy as much stuff from us. That's a trade deficit. It's not a fundamental problem. It's the fact that they produce cheap goods, and we buy those cheap goods. And the other thing that's a little bit problematic here is most of the U.S.'s export surplus comes from our services, and this is only measuring the goods. And so it's missing an entire portion of the economy when they're doing these calculations. But that's a different issue. So I'm kind of concerned. I'm kind of wondering why they chose this equation, where it came from. And I'll show you something that could be maybe one of the sources. All right, so if you wanted to be able to calculate a formula similar to what it is, like let's say that your goal is to get rid of trade deficits, and you didn't know how to do that, and you decided, I'm going to go to ChatGPT, and I'm just going to ask them, what would be an easy way to calculate the tariffs? Let's just do that. To eliminate the trade deficit. To eliminate a trade deficit. What is a tricky equation? That's interesting. Because what it says right here is, it sounds like you just slap a math formula on it to fix a trade deficit. In practice, it's not that straightforward. You know? But here's the equation you could use. All right? So the equation that even ChatGPT warns you, don't use this equation. But then it gives you the equation. The required average tariff rate is equal to the deficit divided by the imports. That's it. That's the same equation as right here. Well, right here. Deficit divided by imports. Now they do have this multiplied times 1, but that's the same equation, right? Clear all that and then do this. Let's see if it does it again. I asked it in a different way. This is a more complicated text. Now it's saying, okay, here's the goal. We're trying to aim for a balanced trade relationship. Here's an easy way to calculate the equation. Here's the equation. Required tariff rate equals the trade deficit divided by the total imports. And it gives us an example of that. And I added a minimum. So again, if there's a minimum tariff at 10%, you'd use 10%. So there we go. Add elasticity to that equation. Okay. Now it just adds an elasticity change on the bottom, and that's effectively what was done. So there's some problems that we're making these huge economic policies with major ramifications, potentially increasing the cost of goods and services in the US by 10%. And ChatGPT doesn't even think it's a good idea to use the equation that ChatGPT suggests. All of the actual economics literature is far more advanced than this equation. Although this equation looks fancy because it has Greek letters, it's not the level of fancy that comes from actual econometrics. And again, there's a lot more than just one of these equations in these calculating models that they were using. So there's some issues with how that was calculated. There's some issues with what the actual number are. But the biggest issue to me is still going to go back to, what is the scope of this change? How is this going to impact supply chain management? How is this going to change the fundamental situation that we're dealing with in supply chain management? Oh, what happens when there is an increase in taxes, right? In the immediate effect, this was released yesterday and it goes in place in like 2 days. So you're not going to be able to change your supplier. can't change suppliers in a couple of days. It's going to take months to be able to find and identify new suppliers. So in the very short run, prices are going to go up. And again, it's 100% pass-through rate from all the evidence we've seen. So prices are going to go up by 10% on every imported product, which is most components and most products that we use. Because we import so many more than we export. But so that's going to happen almost immediately. And then in the long term, what will happen when it's more expensive to source from these different countries? We'll either try to find alternative sources that are cheaper or just pay additional costs on those products, right? Will manufacturing come back to the United States? Probably to some degree, this will increase some manufacturing in the United States. And that's one of the reasons that tariffs are often argued by industry groups is, well, if there's a huge tariff on other goods, the product I sell, I can sell my overpriced product easier. But everyone who buys that overpriced product has to pay the high rates. So for the consumer, the rates stay high, even if some of the production moves domestic. And the actual amount of production that moves domestic is limited. So it's not really certain to me that that will work. One of the reasons I think this is because when you actually look at sourcing costs from worldwide versus the US, sourcing costs are driven by specialization and different access to resources that are cheaper. So in countries like the US, the labor cost is very high. The population is educated, they tend to be able to add more value. And so for the most part, the cost of living is very high and the cost of labor is very high. So if you have a labor intensive product, such as raw materials gathering, mining, manufacturing, it's just not competitive to make things in the United States. One of the sourcing projects that I assign students is to take a mouse and take all the component parts out of the mouse and then price each of those different component parts. If you source that using a global sourcing approach, you source a lot of things from Asia, and the mouse tends to be around $1 to $2 in raw material component pricing. And that's just searching through the internet trying to look for good deals on those different components. If you do the same thing, but restrict yourself to US-based suppliers, that same thing ends up being around $15 to make that mouse, which is twice what the final finished good costs at retail when you buy that on Amazon. So it's not competitive to make things in the United States. And even those sources that are US-based suppliers tend to be sourcing internationally as well for all the actual components they use. So the US-based USB wire supplier that I checked out once was just simply buying wires and components internationally and then using US-based prices to charge a 400% markup and selling goods made in Europe as US-made products and doing a relabeling thing on it. So you just can't compete at that level. So there's going to be a huge impact in terms of the total cost. And it's not going to make most manufacturing more competitive. What it's going to do is it's going to probably protect a few special interest manufacturing groups from foreign competition, but then also increase their costs of all their products by another 10% because they're also going to be importing things. So I don't see the potential benefit of this, especially because it's such a widespread, broad impact. And I think it's gonna. I think there's some issues